Hello, and welcome back to The Walk and Talk, the dog training podcast that pulls back the curtain on what's going on inside your dog's brain and gives you practical solutions and training tips to help with all of the quirks, trials, and tribulations that come with sharing your life with an adorable but sometimes challenging four-legged best friend. Now, without further ado, today's topic is inspired by a question that one of my training club members asked that they put in the Q&A in the online training club about puppy socialization and the long-term effects or features or benefits of getting that right, or maybe getting it wrong, the effects of getting it wrong when it comes to adolescence. Because a really, really common struggle faced by owners of teenage dogs is this moment that hits, right? Maybe around about 7 or 8 months ish, variation allowed, maybe a bit later, when your puppy classes are over and you've done all your weeks and weeks of taking your cute little puppy out to the park, and you've taken them to the pub and the shop, and you've walked around with them tucked under your coat, and you've shown them cars and buses and umbrellas and vacuum cleaners and everything you can possibly think of, all of that jazz. And then suddenly you begin to notice the shift round about 8 months ish. Suddenly, the dog who used to happily greet people or just merrily walk past them on every single walk starts barking at someone for the first time ever. Maybe they hesitate in places where they used to walk confidently, not a problem at all. Maybe they've been in the car loads and loads of times previously with absolutely no problems. And now all of a sudden you put them in the car and they've started whining, or they're just sitting there shaking, or they're barking at things out of the window. Maybe they've just started to look or act really unsure or hesitant in places where they always used to behave completely normally. And you never even thought it was a problem. And it's around about now that owners often start worrying that something has gone wrong, that they have done something wrong, or there has been some kind of negatively impactful experience that their young dog has had that has just messed things up, or that they've generally just not getting it right because it's their first dog and they didn't really know what they were doing, and they're just generally not getting it right with handling their dog's transition towards adulthood. And if you can relate to any of this, you might find yourself asking questions like, has my dog suddenly forgotten all their socialization? All of those visits we did, all of those soundtracks that we played on YouTube or on our phones, where has all of that learning gone? What was the point of putting all that effort in? Or on the flip side, maybe you're panicking and thinking, oh my God, did we just like isolate them too much? Were we too chilled out about the whole thing? Did we spend too much time just sitting at home playing with the puppy? And, we didn't really look at that socialization checklist like thoroughly enough. We didn't tick enough boxes. Or have I accidentally made them fearful because of something I've done? Was it when I hit that speed bump too fast in the car, or I beeped that horn at that person really loudly and startled them? Or was it when we went into the pub last week and we chose that table next to those like really noisy, boisterous children? Have I mucked it all up by doing one of those things? So today, if any of those are relatable to you, I want to help you. I want to unpack what is actually happening inside the adolescent brain, because I personally believe that knowledge is power, right? And it's actually, hopefully, reassurance as well. And once you can better understand the neuroscience behind this stage of development, a lot of these changes that you are struggling with and these worries, they can suddenly start to make so much more sense. And you can just take a little breath, a little sigh of relief. Okay. And more importantly, you'll understand how to move forward in a way that actually builds confidence and delivers you the progress that you want towards your long-term goals with your dog, rather than accidentally getting all panicky and making things harder for yourself or just getting yourself stuck. So, one of the most important things to understand about canine adolescence is that it is not just like a behavioral glitch, but it's a neurologically really significant stage for our dog's development. Because between, let's say, approximately, because it varies between the size of your dog and the breed of your dog and all of that kind of stuff, but roughly, let's say 6 months and 2 years of age, let's broadly call that window adolescence, right? And the canine brain is going through a huge restructuring process during that time, where essentially the brain is basically refining its wiring, if you like. So when dogs are born, their brains contain this huge number of neural connections and possibilities, far more than they will actually keep long term. And during adolescence, the brain begins a process called synaptic pruning. Now, this is essentially where the brain starts reviewing all of the neural connections it created during puppyhood and asking a really simple question. Is this still important? And the best way to view this, I think, is essentially it's like a use it or lose it approach, okay? The brain is decluttering its wardrobe, and it's gonna just throw out all of the shoes that are shoved down the back that simply haven't been worn for a year or 2 years. And it's gonna keep all of the shoes at the very front of the wardrobe that are our absolute staple go to shoes, our comfy favorite shoes that are really well trodden in because we reach for those shoes and we wear them every day or every week or however often. So, the connections in the brain that are used, that are repeated regularly, these are the ones that become stronger and faster. And equally, the connections that aren't used very often, these are the ones that stand a much higher chance of just gradually weakening or disappearing altogether. There's a famous phrase in neuroscience that basically sums this up in one sentence, which is that neurons that fire together wire together. So, in other words, the brain strengthens the pathways that are repeatedly activated, which represent the choices our dog is repeatedly making or the behaviors that they are repeatedly choosing. And so the opposite of that is also true. If certain experiences stop happening for a while, the brain may well end up weakening those pathways. Or if we think of the analogy as a literal pathway, right? So forget the wardrobe, we're walking a footpath. The footpaths that don't get walked frequently, they end up getting like overgrown and neglected and, strewn with weeds or whatever. And so then they become harder and harder for us to re-access them and use them over time. Now, this doesn't mean that all of that learning that I'm talking about has just vanished forever, but it can mean that the dog becomes a little bit rusty or a little bit hesitant or unsure again. And this is one of the reasons teenage dogs sometimes appear to lose confidence in things that once felt normal. And we can see these little adolescent niggles and quirks suddenly start to crop up again. Now, this is not just anecdotal, although you only have to speak to a group of teenage dog owners to see how strong the anecdotal evidence for this is. But there was a really interesting study, right, published in 2020, that's worth mentioning, by behavioural researchers at the University of Nottingham and Newcastle University. And it looked at changes in behaviour during canine adolescence. And the researchers basically followed a group of dogs as they moved through the teenage developmental stage. So I think there were 3 check-ins. I feel like it was 5 months, 8 months, and then I don't know what the adult one was. But then at the end of adolescence. And they found basically that many of the dogs showed an increase in conflict behavior. They showed reduced obedience to their primary caregivers, and they showed a greater stress and anxiety relating to separation or relating to unfamiliar people, like novel characters, compared to their pre adolescent behavior. But what's really interesting is that the study also found, just to give you some hope, that these changes were very often temporary and they were developmentally normal. It was broad spectrum because the adolescent brain is simply going through a process of recalibrating how it processes the world. So, when a dog hitting adolescence suddenly seems to become nervous or more cautious around strangers, it really doesn't necessarily mean that anything has gone wrong. It may simply mean that the brain is entering a phase where it's becoming more sensitive to evaluating potential threats. And if you think about it, right, from an evolutionary perspective, that actually makes a lot of sense. That's perfectly reasonable because adolescence is the stage where typically animals begin exploring the environment more independently. And so the brain needs to become slightly more cautious in order to keep that animal safe. Survival has basically always been the end game, and it still is, even though these domesticated dogs are actually like curling up in front of Bridgerton after a button up box every evening. Their survival brains have not caught up with that fact yet in the slightest. And neither have ours, by the way. Neither have ours. So we don't need to slam on dogs too much because we're all rowing along in more or less the same boat here. So I think to understand this a bit better, we need to also talk about a tiny structure in the brain called the amygdala, which is essentially part of the brain's threat detection system. You all know I like to call it Captain Panic because I've talked about it many times previously. And Captain Panic's job is basically to help animals evaluate whether something in the environment might be dangerous. And during adolescence, the amygdala becomes particularly like active and responsive, which makes sense, right? This is the first time that we're beginning to break away and move independently. We don't have like mother dog watching over our shoulder, keeping all the danger from the door. So we need to up our game. We need to get a lot more savvy about the potential risks in the environment if we're actually going to stay alive long enough to breed. And so this means that teenage dogs are incredibly likely to suddenly start noticing things that never bothered them before. And it can be the most benign of things because really they are essentially just blanket scanning for novelty. And a really good example of this, okay, for my Labrador in particular, when she was younger, and she, for the record, is the gentlest, friendliest, most good natured, easygoing adult dog in the world. She's your typical stereotypical Labrador. She's a good egg all round. But a good example of this for her is when people would suddenly stand still on a footpath, basically. So, was she ever worried about people or human beings or strangers in general? Absolutely not. Categorically, no. She loves them far too much. Whenever I would take her to the vets when she was younger, they'd say, "Is she aggressive at all?" I would say, "No, if anything, she's like aggressively friendly. She's too friendly." I think someone could literally break into my house and she would just lick their face and take them straight to the jewelry box. Like, does she mind people walking past her, being near her, being noisy, touching her, walking in a weird way with a limp or a stick or a strange gait or anything like that? No, absolutely not. Not a problem. Does she mind people who are standing still? Like maybe you pass a group of people who are just having a chat, or you pass someone taking some photographs, or they're just admiring the view. Absolutely not. She doesn't mind that in the slightest. She's quite happy. She's completely ambivalent, to be honest. But one thing that did used to freak her out is basically when someone's walking towards us when we're out on a dog walk and then they spot her And obviously, I'm guessing from their behavior that follows that these people have some kind of phobia of big dogs, right? Which some people are scared of dogs, fine. And they would spot her and then they would suddenly freeze or visibly panic and like leap off to the side of the path or like squish themselves up against the wall and just kind of stand there like in a panic, like I'm just going to stand here until the dog's gone. Just stand like a statue and wait for the dog to get past. Now that would get a reaction from her. Ironically, right? Because I'm sure the last thing that these severely dog phobic people want is a big dog to come up to them and give them a woof. And yet they actually induced it by not simply continuing on their merry way past. If they'd have just carried on walking, she wouldn't have even looked at them. But because what they've chosen to do, in her eyes, is really weird. Like, that is out of the range of normality. It does not tally with any example of normal human footpath behavior that she's used to at all 99.9% of the time. And because it's so strange, it's a complete novelty in the environment. And therefore, the amygdala says this might signal danger. And for your teenage dog, maybe it might just be a stranger standing still, or a person moving suddenly, or a brand new environment, or like a really weird novel smell they've never smelled before, or a noise that previously never really registered, but suddenly now it does. And any of those things can be enough because their brain is temporarily operating with like a heightened threat detection system. But again, this doesn't mean the dog is becoming permanently fearful. It means the brain is temporarily paying closer attention to any kind of potential risk. Now, this is usually when many owners start wondering, well, does this mean then that all of that socialization stuff we did when they were a puppy was just pointless then, just a waste of time? And the answer is absolutely not. Absolutely not. We can't ever fall down the well of thinking that. Early socialization is incredibly valuable. There is research going all the way back to the classic stuff of behavioral scientists like John Paul Scott, John Fuller in the 60s, demonstrating how important early experiences are in shaping long-term canine behavior. Their research showed us that puppies who were exposed to, a variety of people and environments and situations during their early development, those puppies were far more adaptable later in life. It was this work that gave us, the socialization period and the knowledge about fear periods, because all of those early experiences during that window of opportunity, if you like, build the foundation of familiarity. But it's really important to also understand that socialization is not a one-time event. It's not just a one and done. It's not something we tick off a checklist during the first 12 weeks and then we just never revisit it again. It's more like a language that the brain benefits from practicing regularly, just like learning a language at school, which I was forced to do against my will as a GCSE, by the way. I still know how to say my horse is in the built-in wardrobe in German, if you ever need that. No one has ever needed that. But if there's an emergency should arise, I can definitely communicate that to a German person. And if you studied a language when you were younger, but then you never spoke it again for like 10 years, a lot of that knowledge is still somewhere in your brain. You might go off to that country and sit in a cafe and hear people talking around you, and you'll realize, oh, I actually kind of understand what they're talking about. Like I can get the vague gist, they're talking about food or they're talking about the weather. But you are definitely going to be a little bit rusty, to say the least. And dogs can be very similar because adolescence is essentially the stage where the brain decides all of these experiences in this storage box, in this inbuilt wardrobe in my brain, are these experiences still relevant to my life? And if the brain hasn't revisited them for a while, then it may just temporarily become less confident in navigating them. Now, another important topic that's worth briefly looking at here is fear sensitivity periods, because we know that dogs go through several developmental windows where their brains are more sensitive to potentially threatening experiences, like I've already talked about. And one of these often occurs during adolescence. So during these windows, what happens is essentially the brain becomes better, if you like, at learning from negative experiences. So those negative experiences become even more impactful. And again, if we think from a survival perspective, that makes total sense. If a young animal is beginning to explore the world independently, it makes sense that it needs to be able to quickly and effectively learn what might be dangerous. And it also makes sense that the brain needs to make double sure that it remembers those facts. So if we're out exploring and suddenly a massive lion or a bear leaps out from behind a bush and we just narrowly escape it somehow, we better make triple sure that we remember exactly where we were and which bush it leapt out from, or exactly what noise it made before it leapt out that alerted us to get a little head start so that we can ensure that it doesn't kill us next time. So, this is wonderfully efficient, right, as a survival mechanism for keeping us alive. But it also means that negative or overwhelming experiences like that during this stage of development can have a stronger impact. And this is why, when we are working with adolescent dogs who are becoming more cautious, our goal is not simply to just expose them to more and more things, just to keep, pushing them out there into this overwhelming and scary world and just, making them get on with it and get used to it. But we need to balance it by creating manageable, positive experiences, just like we tried to do in puppyhood, that help the brain to update its predictions about the world. I think one of the things I often see owners worry about is whether they are actually being too cautious when they get to this stage of adolescence and they're seeing their dog get really nervy and anxious about things, because I think sometimes people feel the pressure to just keep pushing exposure, but it's so important that we understand that it's not just exposure that is critical, but it's the prioritization of positive exposure, because confidence doesn't grow from overwhelming experiences. We must all, have experiences that have taught us this ourselves as people, right? Confidence grows from successful experiences. And from a neuroscience perspective, every time a dog encounters something uncertain, but they go on to discover that nothing bad happens, their brain is going to slowly update its prediction. The amygdala becomes less reactive. The thinking parts of the brain begin to play a bigger and bigger role over time, because we have to remember, in the darkest depths of our despair, when it comes to our dog's problem behavior sometimes, there's a little gem in the dark called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the brain's capacity to change based on experience. So every positive exposure, every calm observation, every moment where the dog manages to process something new without panic and without a negative impact, all of those experiences help to reshape the brain's expectations. And I know that sometimes progress can feel frustratingly slow, but it's really important to understand that fear and confidence don't change overnight. The brain learns ultimately through repetition, repetition, repetition. Every time the dog experiences a situation where their prediction of danger turns out to be wrong, the brain updates itself just a little bit. If you have ever heard of prediction error learning, what I'm talking about, this is basically what that is. The brain expected something bad, nothing bad actually happened. So the brain gradually over time adjusts its expectations. And as time goes on, those adjustments accumulate. But because the process is gradual, to us, that progress can sometimes feel really slow and frustrating and like we're not getting anywhere. And I know that's really annoying, but neurologically speaking, slow progress is actually how really durable behavioral change is built. If you ever come across an animal behavior professional and they promise you they can guarantee to fix a behavior issue in one day or in 1 week or whatever it is, I promise you, you don't want to agree to the methods they're going to attempt to use in order to deliver that. Like it's just not something you want to get into. Anyway, I'm not here to bash. Let's get practical. So, if you have an adolescent dog who has now become maybe more nervy or more cautious, what does moving forward actually look like? So, firstly, I would politely encourage you to respect their hesitation somewhat. If your dog is telling you that an environment feels overwhelming right now, that information is valuable to you, so don't ignore it. Now, that's not to say we just avoid the world forever. That's important. That's really important. But it does mean that we do our best to meet the dog where they currently are. And we just prioritize building up from that point. So think about how you can rebuild confidence through manageable environments, quiet parks, low pressure walks, uh, training games that the dog already knows in places where the dog is still capable of thinking and learning, and then just continue revisiting the world in tiny little doses, small and regular. Think of adolescence as the stage where socialization needs some revision sessions, shall we say. Not intense exposure, but just plenty of gentle reminders that the world is safe and predictable. And if you do encounter novelty, be sure to pair it with positive experiences at every available opportunity. So if you have a teenage dog who is a little bit nervy and anxious, and you're going out on walks where you know you can't 100% control what the environment is going to deliver you, please be prepared for that. Please go out with something in your pocket, whether that is a tug toy, whether that is some chopped up sausage or some kibble or treats or whatever it is. Take something out with you so that, should something surprising happen and you're caught off guard, you are able to create a positive pairing as best you can. The goal is ultimately to help the dog feel capable, because when a dog feels capable, their confidence is going to grow naturally. So, if your teenage dog has become more cautious or more reactive or more nervous, please know this is something that so many owners experience. It absolutely does not erase all the work you did with them when they were a puppy. That work was important. That created your foundation. And adolescence is simply the stage where the brain is starting to reorganize itself and it's deciding what information to keep and what is less important. And you can absolutely help with that by setting up supportive experiences and working at a pace that respects the dog's emotional state. Those pathways for confidence can absolutely strengthen up again. In fact, many dogs who go through this stage thoughtfully, they can actually emerge as incredibly resilient adults. It's not the be all and end all of their personality, because they didn't just experience the world blindly and chaotically, but they really learned how to process it. Okay, teenage dogs, I know, can be a lot of hard work, but they can also be incredibly good fun. I promise you, my dog is only 2 years old, so I'm only just on the other side of this. If I'm fully on the other side, I'm not sure. And you have to remember ultimately that there will come a time, hopefully for all of us, where we are sat beside a very elderly, four legged best friend who we've shared well over a decade of adventures and memories with. And all of these trials and tribulations of their younger years will actually become the funniest stories that you tell other people about them. And that's coming from someone who lost one elderly dog 2 years ago, and I'm now living with another. I know that maybe right now you can't imagine a world where things are calmer or quieter or just a non issue, but I promise you it's coming. And if you are really thick in the trenches and you want some more support with the stage you're at with your dog right now, you can come and join us in the online training club anytime whatsoever. I will leave a link in the show notes. There's a very, very lovely gang of predominantly adolescent dog owners actually in there already, and you'd always be most welcome to join us for weekly training lessons, problem solving Q&As with me, regular opportunities for individual feedback, and oodles of downloadable resources and guides and goodies. But for now, I think I have waffled on for long enough. So I will leave you to enjoy the rest of your walk. And I will see you same time next week for another episode of The Walk and Talk.